Hello, and thank you everyone for joining our REAP webinar today on August 22nd. This is a San Joaquin Valley REAP, that's Regional Early Action Planning workshop series. We've had it every month for all of last year and every other month for this year. Today's topic is on inclusionary housing. We have the team from EPS here to walk us through an analysis they did of the San Joaquin Valley, looking at the potential for the inclusionary housing as a tool to help increase the amount of housing planning and production in the Valley. So it's a very unique presentation. We hope you enjoy it. I'll go through a few house rules, but let me introduce our co-hosts, Robert Phipps and I. Robert, go ahead and say hi. I'm out of Fresno Clovis area. I'm a consultant. Robert is with Fresno COG, and we both manage the San Joaquin Valley REAP program. A few house rules here. This will be like a 35-minute presentation, and then we'll take questions and answers. There may be a lot of questions during the presentation, and we can handle that as well and take a break. But to ask a question, you can raise your hand using the raise hand function. You can use the question and answer function, or you could use the chat function if you like. This workshop webinar will be done by 2 p.m. Most of them last about 1 hour. The flyer for the workshop's on the screen, and the APA CM course numbers outlined on the flyer if you're taking this class to get credit for your AICP certification. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slide deck from today will be posted to the San Joaquin Valley REAP webpage in about 2 days. I'll also send a post-workshop evaluation to you. If you can provide any feedback to us, that would be greatly appreciated as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Randy Hatch, say hi, Randy. Randy's there. He's on our San Joaquin Valley REAP team, and he's a seasoned land use professional, so we always have him on as a panelist as well to help us with the presentation. And then the lead presenters today are Ashley Kanat with EPS, Economic Planning Systems in the Bay Area. So go ahead and say hi, Ashley, introduce your team, and you are welcome to start the presentation.
Okay, excellent. Let me just pull up, I will introduce my team as I pull up my slides here. Walking and talking at the same time. All right, am I sharing? Yes, okay, excellent. Well, good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be with you today. We're super excited to share with all of you what we've learned as we explored the potential for inclusionary housing in the San Joaquin Valley. As Michael said, my name is Ashley Kanat. I'm a principal with Economic and Planning Systems. We've got offices across California and Los Angeles, Oakland, Sacramento, and then also an office in Denver. And my team is here as well. Ryan Martinez is a senior associate. He served as project manager and technical lead, and Bex Allen supported Ryan and me and conducted much of the research that went into this effort. And they'll be available if any of your questions need to get into details or want to understand any of our methodology. So as a backdrop and heading into this, we knew that there are a few cities in the Valley that already have inclusionary programs. We also knew that with the 6th cycle housing elements coming due, jurisdictions across the state are really hungry for programs that can help address RHNA. And so this effort was intended to help jurisdictions by doing some pre-thinking, if you will, some pre-analysis about the potential for inclusionary programs to be successful in the Valley. And that brings us to today. That's the question we hope to address. So let's dive in. So the RFP that was put out by Michael and team identified some very clear questions that we were seeking to answer. One, how do the real estate economics in the San Joaquin Valley support or not support inclusionary policies? And I'll just say right off the bat, it is not a given that inclusionary housing programs work everywhere. So that was one of our foundational questions. Other questions were, what are the production numbers, the real estate economics, the fiscal impacts of the Valley communities that have inclusionary policies? So that had us looking at the cities with programs. What are the best types of inclusionary policies and what alternatives might be able to work in the Valley? And by work, I mean work from a development feasibility perspective, from a political acceptance perspective as well. Which jurisdictions can benefit most from inclusionary policies? Beyond the sort of local focus, what can HCD do? What can the COGS do to further support inclusionary zoning policy? And then how do the inclusionary housing policies align with California's climate change, carbon reduction goals, if at all? And what are the social equity impacts of inclusionary housing to disadvantaged communities? And then finally, how can inclusionary policies be implemented in a manner that really addresses local concerns, builder concerns, political implications, and are they a good option overall? So that's the arc of everything we were trying to address. And this presentation will go into quite a bit of detail on some of these, a little bit less so on others, but there are final deliverables that are available on the website, as Michael mentioned, and that can be shared. So with that, we wanted to start with just a little bit of context. And as I think probably, or many of you likely know, the San Joaquin Valley is among the fastest growing regions of California. It's growing faster than the state as a whole, at least over the course of the past decade. And as in much of the state, the cost of living is rising, including the cost of housing, which is really having the effect of exacerbating housing affordability concerns. And it's against this backdrop of increasing population and rising housing costs that over the course of the next RHNA cycle, San Joaquin Valley jurisdictions are expected to plan for 116,000 plus very low and low income units. That's a lot across the region, very low and low income units. These are units that are hard to build typically. Very low and low income housing, it does not build itself. It doesn't occur without a concerted effort in most cases. And inclusionary housing is one of many tools that cities may be able to use to achieve that lasting affordable housing. So what is it? Before we get too much further, what is inclusionary housing? How does it work? Well, it requires that new market rate residential development projects include a certain percentage of housing units at rents or at sale prices that are affordable to lower income households. At its simplest, that's the idea. And by affordable, what we mean here is that households shouldn't be, or won't spend more than about 30% of their household income on housing related expenses. So as an example, just theoretical example here, if a jurisdiction has a 10% inclusionary requirement and a developer proposes a 20 unit project, 10% of those units, or 2 of them, would be set aside as affordable. At the same time, the law requires that jurisdictions that adopt inclusionary requirements should also allow for alternative means of compliance. And most often what that means is that cities will allow fees to be paid in lieu of constructing the units on site. So thus an in lieu fee. Sometimes cities allow alternative or other means of compliance, such as land dedication or off-site development of affordable units or renovation and preservation of existing affordable units. So a lot of tools, but at the most basic, there's an on-site requirement or an in lieu fee payment. And there are pros and cons to inclusionary housing, depending on your perspective. So in the pro column, inclusionary housing, in the pro column, it increases the supply and the variety of deed restricted affordable housing as market rate development occurs. So there's a pacing that is concurrent with market rate development. And it means that the affordable units are spread throughout projects, and those projects are spread throughout the city. And so there's a diversity in where the units are located. Inclusionary housing it's a tool that can help the city meet its regional housing needs allocation, which is a big feature. It works synergistically with the state density bonus law. They're not competing programs, but a unit that counts towards state density bonus can also satisfy a local inclusionary requirement and vice versa. So that's important. Inclusionary housing provides opportunities for just more people to share in the benefit of economic inclusion. So this gets at the social equity piece. It means that there's, better integration and citywide growth as the market rate development occurs. Along these lines, inclusionary housing can help a city achieve federally mandated fair housing goals and can address issues of segregation and concentrated poverty by making sure that we get that disbursement of affordable units across the city. It can also help a lower wage workforce live in and near the communities where they're working. And so this gets at those carbon goals and decreasing commute times, reducing emissions, that sort of thing. But it's not, not a panacea in all cases. So in the con column, inclusionary housing adds to the cost of developing market rate housing. You hear this a lot, and in speaking with developers, it's true. Either it reduces the revenue potential when the units are built on site because the sales prices or their rents are going to be held to levels that are affordable to income restricted households, or if a developer is paying an in lieu fee, it's adding to the cost of developing that housing. So that's from an economic development feasibility perspective, how that might work. Another con, or in the con column, is that inclusionary requirements and in lieu fees need periodic updating to remain in economic alignment. As market conditions change, as development costs change, as incomes change, the on-site requirements and the in lieu fees can get a little out of whack. And so it's a best practice that cities that have these programs periodically take a look back and make sure that there continues to be alignment. Inclusionary housing programs also require staff resources to administer. So it's not a quick policy decision and then you're off and running. It starts with a policy decision, but then there is administrative work involved in lifting up the program and making sure that all the administrative pieces are in place and that the program can be supported on an ongoing basis. That includes things like making sure, monitoring the program, monitoring units, affordability, qualifying households to be eligible for those units, explaining the program at the counter, for example. So there's an administrative component to it. And then finally, the deed restrictions can just limit some of the value appreciation that is typically associated with real estate. And there may be other cons as well. So in our work, so switching gears a little bit and getting into our analysis and into our framework, in our work on inclusionary programs across the state, we think of there as being about 4 conditions that need to be in place in order for inclusionary programs to be successful. So we call these 4 conditions or four lenses, if you will. And those are market feasibility, development feasibility, administrative feasibility, and political feasibility. And I'll explain each of those. So with respect to market rate feasibility, you only get those inclusionary units if there is sufficient market rate development underway. So we look for signs of market feasibility, meaning are we seeing production numbers and are we seeing those, are we seeing that there's a good volume of market rate activity? If a market is already seeing challenges with respect to residential development, that's a signal to us that there may not be enough capacity or enough production volume to lift up an inclusionary program. With respect to development feasibility, if we can assume or if we see that new market rate residential development is in fact occurring, then we ask, well, what are the rents and what are the sales prices at which that new development is occurring? What we're looking for is we want to see a difference between the development costs and the market values. That difference has to be sufficient enough that the new development can absorb the costs or the reduced revenues of an inclusionary requirement. So is there market rate development occurring? And then is it occurring at rents or prices that are sufficient to support an inclusionary program. From an administrative capacity, I really focused on this before, but does the staff, does the city have the resources to invest in lifting up and monitoring this program going forward? And sometimes the answer there is no, but there's some political will there, and so resources will be allocated to it. In some cases, you see programs and housing elements that are focused on ensuring that the administrative capacity will be there. So this isn't, if there is not administrative capacity, it does not mean that an inclusionary housing program cannot be effective. It's just another consideration. And then finally, political feasibility. So you can have all of the other three conditions in place and then have a city council that doesn't want to adopt a program, or even a city council that wants to adopt a program, but there's a lot of discussion at a council meeting. And if there isn't political will to adopt this program from the get-go, there can be some challenges, of course. So basically what we're looking for with this political feasibility lens is there political support among policymakers and elected officials to adopt a program? So we'll come back to each of these lenses of feasibility throughout the presentation. But first, we wanted to just briefly describe the 4 programs that are currently in place among Valley jurisdictions. And we prepared a memo that summarized how these programs are working in jurisdictions. So that's available if you want a little bit more detail. There are, as I noted, there are 4 cities in the Valley that have inclusionary programs. In most cases, they've been in place for some time. Escalon is going from north to south. Escalon, Ripon, Patterson, and McFarland. Each of the programs is really different, and they've taken a tailored and sort of nuanced approach in each case. Also, in each case, the existing programs are not, they don't look to be generating a lot of inclusionary units through the program. In some cases, this might be because the programs were adopted quite a while ago and they haven't been recalibrated or aligned. It could be that the requirements are too high in some cases. I think in each case, the implication, the conclusions vary. One observation is that the slow pace of market rate development is probably the biggest limiting factor in at least a couple of these cities. There are, and then I just mentioned this, but I'll say it again, there are some active inclusionary programs that really were put into effect under different market conditions, in a different market cycle, and they may not reflect the jurisdiction's current priorities. And I'll just note that it is definitely a best practice for cities that have these programs to do a look back and recalibrate the program from time to time. So I think I won't go through all of this in that detailed of a way. I'll just sort of flash up here for you. In Escalon, there are requirements on both ownership and rental development. With a bit of a range, 10 to 15% to be depending on the income levels. As they look back as they reported to us and through the annual progress report submitted to HCD, only 19 units were constructed between 2018 and 2021, and those were all market rate. It's true that in Escalon, they have a threshold size of 5 units or more, so it's possible that some of the development they were seeing was below that threshold and wasn't subject to the inclusionary requirement. In McFarland, the program also applies to ownership and rental. And I'm making that distinction, by the way, because cities don't have to adopt, or oftentimes inclusionary programs vary depending on whether the new development is rental or ownership, just because the development economics of these different types of residential product really vary significantly. But in McFarland, their ownership requirement is at least 20%, very low, or moderate. The rental requirement is somewhat lower, at least 15%. And according to staff, the housing was really affordable, sort of both before and after. So they've got other ways of achieving affordable housing in McFarland. Really in McFarland, there's been very little development. In Patterson, the requirement is also on ownership and rental, 15% in both cases. On ownership, they're targeting more moderate and low income housing. On rental, targeting low and very low. And this might be a good place to mention that it's fairly typical that you don't see very low income households being targeted in ownership programs. The reason for that is that it can be really difficult to qualify a very low income household for home ownership. In beyond just qualifying for a mortgage, there are a lot of other expenses associated with home ownership, often HOAs and property taxes, insurance, upkeep and maintenance, those sorts of things. So it's the collection of costs that can make it very challenging to get a very low income household into an ownership scenario. So the way that Patterson's is structured here, we see that pretty frequently. In Ripon, the program only applies to ownership development. They don't have a rental program. And Ripon is interesting because they also have identified a segment of the population, really a middle income segment that is, maybe they don't fall into the HCD income limits of very low, moderate, but they are still facing challenges getting into housing and being able to afford housing. And so Ripon has demonstrated this or identified this other segment, and their inclusionary program is looking to address housing in those segments. So after studying the programs that already exist in the Valley, we selected 4 cities to study as case studies. And we were trying to understand, through this case study effort, we were trying to understand the types of inclusionary programs that could work well in the Valley. And the case study jurisdictions were selected to exhibit diverse outcomes. So we were thoughtful about which cities we picked. And we wanted to use them to underscore that inclusionary policies are not the right solution in every community. So 2 of our 4 cities already have inclusionary programs, Ripon and McFarland. 2 do not. We wanted to showcase both of those situations. And we settled on Stockton. So the 4 are Stockton, Ripon, Visalia, and McFarland. We were looking for geographic diversity. We were looking for market rate production diversity. We were looking for price point diversity. We're just wanting to reflect conditions across the Valley so that if you represent a jurisdiction, for example, that isn't one of these 4, you would have a way of thinking about the potential for inclusionary programs in your jurisdiction by aligning with one of these cities, potentially. So let's start with Stockton, and there's a lot of information on this page, and what I'll really try to do mostly is orient you to the type of information we were collecting and reporting on. And this information is, of course, available in the deliverable as well that I believe is on the website. Stockton is in the, you all know this, it's in the northern part of the Valley. It's in the sphere of the Bay Area pricing pressures, and so that was one of the things we wanted to reflect. And in the past several years, the city's experienced really steady development, seeing really a mix of market rate and affordable development. So this is getting at the market rate feasibility lens, right? They're seeing market rate development occurring. As a little bit of an aside, the affordable development that they're seeing is occurring primarily in the form of 100% affordable, LIHTC subsidized projects. But they've also been really successful in negotiating for inclusionary units through development agreements, even in the absence of a formal inclusionary program. With respect to the development feasibility piece of it, new market rate development tends to command a price premium relative to the existing housing stock. Meaning if you look on Redfin or Zillow or something like that to get a sense of what existing sales prices are of single family homes, you'll get one level, but what a newly constructed equivalent home will sell for is more. And that's the segment that we're looking at because this is a requirement that would apply to new construction. So in Stockton, the median sales price of a newly constructed home is in the neighborhood of around $550,000. And then the average rent for, again, a newly constructed apartment is about $2,000 a month. And the way that we test for development feasibility is by comparing the market rate values that I just identified of this newly constructed product to the costs of developing that new product. So we identified two prototypes that reflect the type of development in the city: a 2,000 square foot single family home, 8 units to the acre, and then a 2-bedroom, 1,000 square foot rental apartment at around 30 units to the acre. And then we worked with cost data and we spoke with developers active in the Valley to estimate the costs of building those prototypes. And the single family prototype is estimated to cost about $420,000 to develop. And this cost, while there are similarities in development costs across the Valley, there are differences too, especially with respect to land value. But that single family prototype, if it's estimated to cost around 420,000, and then we compare that with a value of 550,000, that suggests a profit margin of around 30%. And while every developer is going to think about profit margins differently and will make different, go, no-go decisions based on the particular circumstances of a given project, most developers would be pretty pleased to move forward with a project at a 15% profit margin. So a profit margin of 30% demonstrates to us that there likely is capacity or headroom, if you will, in that profit to accommodate an inclusionary requirement. That doesn't mean that everyone will be really happy to accommodate an inclusionary requirement. It just means that we wouldn't expect the pace or the volume of market rate development to be negatively impacted. For our rental prototype, that's an investment product, right? And it delivers its returns in the form of rental revenue. So we think about profit a little bit differently, more like as a yield on cost. And our threshold for feasibility is 5.5% after having conversations with developers in the Valley. So higher than 5.5%, we'd expect multifamily developers to move ahead and proceed with projects. Below that threshold, there might be other considerations at play, other considerations that might be just causing developers to pause a little bit. And based on prospective rents in Stockton and development costs of approximately $316,000 per door, we calculate a yield on cost of 5.9%. And again, with that, we think there is potential to accommodate an inclusionary requirement. So in Stockton, so far, we're seeing market rate or market feasibility. That's our sort of top left there. We're seeing development feasibility. That's our bottom right. Oh, I'm sorry. Market development is our top right. Development feasibility is our bottom right. If we turn to capacity, administrative capacity, we heard from city staff that while they're very committed to advancing their city's housing objectives, it would be a big challenge for them at this time to implement and administer and monitor a new program. As for stakeholder support and political will, there's a general wariness among Valley jurisdictions to support programs that really add to the cost of development. Although we see that there are some cities that have already adopted programs, more broadly, we're seeing this wariness. So, and that's certainly true in Stockton, where the BIA and the Builders Industry Association is a very strong presence. But ultimately, it's going to be up to each city to decide how to handle the competing pressures. And on one hand, the need to develop much more affordable housing, and on the other hand, a reluctance to appear anti-development. So we have one of these sheets, and we went through this analysis for our 4 studies. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to go through the other case studies much more quickly, just focusing on the lessons learned and the implications. So in Ripon, this is a jurisdiction that, again, already has an inclusionary program, and we're seeing a really modest pace of new market rate development, but at very high price points. And so we're seeing profit margins and yields that have the capacity to absorb the inclusionary requirements that are in the program. And in Ripon, the city really leans into its inclusionary program because they've got a strong preference to have the units provided on site as opposed to the 100% affordable projects, because that allows them to promote income diversity and to avoid concentrating affordable units in one location. But all of that said, it's really important in Ripon and in other places to periodically recalibrate inclusionary programs just to make sure that the program is reflecting current market and economic dynamics. So that was one of the lessons learned in Ripon, rather. The story changes just a little bit in Visalia. And in this city, while we're seeing market rate development occur, we don't see the profit margins on the single family development that is sufficient to accommodate an inclusionary requirement at this time. There might be a little bit more room on the multifamily rental side. And the lesson here really is that cities can choose to adopt inclusionary requirements on rental or ownership or both, as we saw in one of the cities that has a program. However, in Visalia, after talking with staff, the administrative capacity is really limited, and the political will, which they did go through a bit of a process and was tested recently, is not there at this time. McFarland is our fourth case study city, and it has an inclusionary program, as you'll recall, suggesting that there is political will, or there was, but at this time we really aren't seeing the market feasibility or the development feasibility. We're not seeing a strong pace of new development. And the city of McFarland would be, one observation is they could take another look at their inclusionary program. It was adopted a long time ago in 2005 to see if it could be recalibrated to better reflect local and current conditions. So this is just a brief summary of the feasibility analysis that we just went through in each of the 4 cities, but it lays it all out just side by side for a quick snapshot. For each prototype, our for sale single family detached and our multifamily rental, we identified per unit development costs and sales prices for each product type, and then we calculate the profit metric. So the green check marks mean we estimate an inclusionary program would be feasible, while a red check mark means inclusionary may not be feasible. And we haven't gone so far in any of these cases to identify what level of inclusionary might work in the cities with a green check mark. That's something the cities might want to take on in the future. So the implications for other jurisdictions in the Valley are that jurisdictions may be able to support an inclusionary program if they're seeing market rate development occurring at a significant scale, if the market rate values are exceeding the cost of new development, not just by a little bit or not just enough to make the market rate development happen, but really at a substantial margin. So for example, in locations with very high market demand and price pressures. And jurisdictions are likely unable or it may be more challenging to support an inclusionary program if the market rate development is occurring at low levels or if the pricing is low, relevant to development costs or less than development costs for that matter. We also went through a very, very high level thought exercise to try to estimate the potential impact that inclusionary programs could have valley-wide. So we evaluated the valley-wide RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, focusing on the above moderate allocation. And these are, we were focused on above moderate, at least initially, because these are the market rate projects that the inclusionary requirements would apply to. So valley-wide, there are 117,000 above moderate units required by RHNA. And we then asked, okay, well, what happens if 10% or 20% or 30% of those above moderate units end up being developed in jurisdictions that have or adopt inclusionary programs? And we then took an additional slice, if you will, knowing that most cities that adopt inclusionary programs adopt project size thresholds, meaning, like something along the lines of projects of 5 or more units or 10 or more units, meaning, and what that means is that there's a lot of new smaller scale or infill market rate development that would be completely exempt from an inclusionary program, even if a city has a program. Then we establish a range of what the inclusionary requirements might be. 5%, 10%, 15%, and we run through that math. And the result is that with all of those caveats, so under those circumstances, between 439 and 3,950 affordable units could be created through inclusionary programs. A lot of conditions would need to be in place there. We were also asked to brainstorm recommendations for jurisdictions, COGS, and HCD. And for jurisdictions, we've got 4 items here. Education really is key. Knowing how inclusionary works and under what circumstances it can be effective, and making sure that elected officials also have that education. And if you're one of those cities where inclusionary may be effective, you can consider adopting a program, but phasing it in so that it doesn't hit the market all at once. Or you could consider making the inclusionary requirement apply just in certain areas or zones where you're expecting higher density development. So when adopting a program, it doesn't need to be a one size fits all approach. You can even establish a program where the in lieu fee is set a little bit lower than the on-site requirement, where you're creating an incentive to pay the fee, and that can help generate revenue for your housing programs. For COGS, staying on top of the market and development trends on behalf of jurisdictions means that jurisdictions will be really ready to go when conditions are right. The COGS can also play a role in monitoring how the existing programs in the Valley are doing. That can be helpful. It's a question that comes up at council meetings all the time. And really leaning into the education piece and helping jurisdictions understand how inclusionary works. That can be very helpful, possibly preparing materials that can be presented as study sessions to councils across the Valley. And then the state density bonus. It's an incentive-based tool rather than just a requirement in the way that inclusionary is. So developing materials and making sure that jurisdictions really understand how the state density bonus program works is an option, especially in cities that don't have the political will for inclusionary right now. And for HCD, it'd be useful, as we talk about development feasibility and economic feasibility, it'd be useful if HCD were to develop a template to evaluate feasibility. Consultants are taking really different approaches to this question right now. We also hear increasingly about how above moderate income households are unable to afford housing. So just like in Ripon, where they acknowledge this, a program that really acknowledges this through incentives and or if HCD were to acknowledge this more overtly through incentives and programs, that would help jurisdictions plan for appropriate housing, because it's a real segment of a lot of communities. And then finally, for small jurisdictions that are intrigued by inclusionary but worried about administrative capacity, some sort of program that really allows jurisdictions to participate in a regional or a sub-regional program and pool resources and RENA credits would be interesting to explore. And then pooling administrative capacity is a corollary to that. And with that, I'll end the presentation, and we've got plenty of time for questions. So I'll stop sharing and turn it over to Robert, who I believe is facilitating any Q&A.
That's right, but as of this moment, there are no open questions. It's a shy group today. Please if you just raise your hand or put your question in the Q&A, we'll be happy to answer it live.
Mm-hmm. And we can pivot to Randy at this time too, Robert, to get his.
I do see Randy's got his hand up.
Go ahead, Randy.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I noticed in the last maybe month, San Francisco had a vigorous inclusionary program, and that they have backed off from that because of the dynamics of the economy. The economic demand, if you will, for ownership and primarily condo units weren't there. Interest rates have risen, and that knocked out a lot of potential buyers. And so in an effort to salvage home sales, because they're worried about the loss of new homes, they backed off from their inclusionary program and basically put it on suspension. And I'm wondering if, in fact, that's a new economic reality we're dealing with, is that it's become harder it's always was hard for people to buy a home, but now with the interest rates and some other challenges, the threshold has risen even more, knocking off some of that economic feasibility that you talked about, Ashley. So comment, questions, reactions?
Well, if that's for me, I haven't been following that story as closely in San Francisco, but what you've identified certainly makes sense. You know, interest rates are putting a lot of pressure on affordability, making affordability much more of a challenge. And what that's doing is widening the gap, right? So when you ask a developer of ownership housing to set aside units affordable to lower income households, that's even more of a subsidy that you are requiring or asking of that developer. So I would be surprised if it in fact impacted the in lieu fee that quickly in real time, but from a on-site ask, that's a real consideration. And it underscores that point that city, it's not a you do it and you're done, right? You really need to stay on top of market conditions and stay aware of those sorts of pressures, because the last thing you want to do is have a requirement in place that is impeding or dampening that market rate development. You get zero if you have zero market rate development, you get zero affordable units, right? And so that's not the goal. And so I wish I'd been following that story a little bit more closely. I'll look into it. But what you're describing doesn't sound, consistent with what is happening in the model.
So we are starting to get some questions in the Q&A. The first one from Carl Davison. I recently heard a talk given by the Lewis Center at UCLA that inclusive ordinances have functioned as a tax on market rate housing. Do you have any comments, thought on that?
No, I'd like to kind of go back and take a look at that. I think, in our work, we try to be very transparent about the fact that there are costs associated with inclusionary programs. If a developer is providing the units on site, it's not really adding to the cost of the development, but it is restricting or holding back the revenues. If a developer is paying an in lieu fee, that is an additional cost. So we try to be very transparent in our analyses, and that's really one of the things we try to get at in our analyses of feasibility. If it's like a tax by any other name, I don't know. It is certainly a cost. I haven't heard the argument that sets it up to be, to relate it as a tax, but I'll look into that talk.
And
Ryan or Bex, have either of you, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I'm not leaving information on the table. Have either of you heard that talk?
No, I haven't heard that talk.
Okay.
Okay, and from Miguel Galvez, do any of the inclusionary housing programs in single family development have an equity sharing provision to generate funds when the homeowner cashes in the benefit?
There are a lot of cities, yes, with inclusionary programs that are increasingly trying to be thoughtful about, well, what happens when this home turns over, and trying to plan ahead for that, where there's some sharing in the equity, both, maybe with the city and with the homeowner, because home ownership is one of the keys to, wealth growth in our country. And so to the extent that inclusionary programs are being thoughtful about that for the ownership programs, they're trying to write that into their ordinances, and there are several that are thinking about it. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, and this next one from Mark Staples may be more of a Michael and Randy question. Are there sufficient developers in the Central Valley that are capable or experienced with affordable housing projects or inclusionary projects to even come close to meeting the valley-wide RHNA? And Ashley, I don't know if you have a thought on that, but given that it's kind of Central Valley specific with regard to the developers who tend to practice here. I don't know if you have, this is open to anyone, but I thought that maybe Randy and Michael might have a leg up on this one.
Well, I'll take a crack at it. Just with my experience in the various cities where I've practiced, the developers are relatively sophisticated, and that they're they understand the concept. They don't necessarily like it, but if they can make a project pencil out, they'll work with the community. And that's the key. You have to have a type of partnership with the for-profit developers so that you can assist and help them to demonstrate that yes, you can still make a profit. You can still cover your costs and sell the units. And you have to stay on top of that, because I worked in one small city and we had a program, and it wasn't in the Central Valley. It was in the Bay Area, so there was a little bit of difference there. But if they could sell their home, the house that they were building, and make a fair, as in terms of their standards, profit, they're willing to work with you. And so the idea of keeping your fingers on the pulse of the market is key in a situation like that. It takes a lot of administrative time for the city and for the developer to kind of work through that together. Answering Mark, I think it is possible, and I think we do have developers that practice in the Central Valley that are capable and would be willing to consider it, but it takes a lot of hand-holding.
And it takes a lot of.
Might just add on. Oh,
Yeah. I was going to say it takes a ton of resources as well. I mean, do we have sufficient developers? No. If we have sufficient developers, the housing market is bifurcated. Either you're affordable or you're a market rate sort of developer. And on the affordable side, it would take billions of dollars to meet our RENA numbers, because affordable housing is a subsidized sort of industry. So I guess my answer is a little bleak there, and the answer is no. Thank you.
Not to put too fine a point on it. I hate it when you beat it around the bush, Michael. I wish you just said what you were really thinking.
I'm seeing a different layer to that question also, which is, and just, I'm wanting to distinguish between housing that's affordable to, lower income, moderate income, low income households that are just not able to compete for housing in the market, versus housing that's a little bit more transitional or supportive, permanent supportive housing, where you're really needing to wrap in programs and amenities on site. It's a very different type of undertaking, and not every market rate developer has the experience or the resources to provide those sort of wraparound services as well. So I'm not sure if that was exactly the question, but just wanted to make that distinction as well.
Okay. And a combination question here from two different folks, same topic from Miguel Galvez and Christine Corrales. Are there sample ordinance and affordability agreements available to be shared with other agencies? And Christine specifies within the San Joaquin, or in San Joaquin County, I guess, as opposed to the San Joaquin Valley, in San Joaquin County.
So there are, 4 cities in the Valley that have programs. In most cases, they were adopted a bit ago, and so they may not reflect, current or emerging best practices. And this would be an excellent thing for, the COG to take, or COGs and, counties to take on. In other places, we've worked for COGs, and we've developed a template ordinance and sort of some accompanying guidelines, so that, an ordinance really has to be created at the local level, of course, but there are templates to follow. And I think a template can get jurisdictions 85% of the way there, and that can just save time and money for the local jurisdiction. So I'll let Michael speak to whether or not, at a sort of valley-wide level, if those resources are available, but I think it's a really a good thing to approach at a regional level, just trying to cut out time and money wherever possible for jurisdictions.
Yeah, we can take a look at that, Robert. We'll talk about it.
Yes. It looks like Michael, you're answering the next one. Do you want me to read that off, or do you want to?
Oh, no, go ahead. I was just gonna cite, it looks like Supreme Court of California, there was a case involving San Jose's ordinance that was upheld as constitutional. So I'll send that link here, but go ahead and read the question.
Okay. So the question is, again, from Miguel Galvez, have any of the inclusionary housing programs been successfully challenged legally? And if so, what were the lessons learned?
Yeah, so the landscape around inclusionary housing the legal landscape has been changing dramatically over the course of the last, 10, 20 years. Recent legislation, AB 1505, and some other case law is making it very, very clear that inclusionary housing is, authorized under a jurisdiction's police powers, unlike impact fees, for example, which are, mitigation, totally different ball of wax, Mitigation Fee Act. So authorized under police powers, and it's now very clear from a legal landscape that inclusionary programs are appropriate on both ownership development and rental development. And there have been no challenges to that in the last couple of years, but it's in the last, since AB 1505, which was 2017 or 2019. I can't remember, that it's crystal clear.
Okay, and then from Mitzi Cooksum, a couple of questions. Do you anticipate the state making this a mandate? As of now, cities have to plan but not develop affordable housing. Who knows?
I don't know. It's you hear cities preparing their housing elements, talking about how they're trying to land the plane while the runway is being built. Really changing, the landscape is changing quickly. I will say that HCD is very aware of this need to balance in inclusionary programs. So, for example, HCD says that if you have an inclusionary program that is higher than 15% targeting lower income households, that you need to demonstrate that such a program is feasible. So below that, they're going to trust that you're doing your due diligence. Above that, they really do start to get concerned that the program might be dampening market rate demand, and so they're signaling to cities that they're keeping both of these thoughts in mind at the same time. I don't have any, crystal ball about, this becoming a mandate, but I think it's a very effective tool in cities where the market and development economics support it, and HCD is aware of the potential dampening effect at the same time. So it's why feasibility studies can be a really critical piece of adopting inclusionary programs.
Okay, and Mitzi's second question, do you anticipate a different version of the redevelopment agency concept?
I know that there's a lot of talk around, so this is not inclusionary housing, so much, but a lot of financing mechanisms like EIFDs and, other workarounds. So I know that jurisdictions are really, really impacted by that decision and really trying to figure out a way forward, trying to look for a regular ongoing source of, funding and financing for affordable housing. And the tool that I see cities most interested in, right now are EIFDs. They have, those are enhanced infrastructure financing districts. It has limited effectiveness in places where the city only has a small share of property tax increment coming back. So that might be a different webinar, different topic, but on the topic of inclusionary housing, no, I'm not particularly involved in any conversations that might shed some light on that question.
Okay, and that does it as far as questions from the audience, just to kind of round things out. Oh, Michael.
Well, there was San Joaquin County is asking for sample inclusionary ordinances or affordability agreements, if anybody knows of those available on a template basis.
And we do have another question from Miguel Galvez. Are there any inclusionary housing programs that are tied to new commercial development where new employers have to contribute to a funding source?
Yeah, so what you're describing, Miguel, is most commonly called a commercial linkage fee. So it's not an inclusionary program where, you know, residential units need to be built on site as part of the project, but a commercial linkage fee is a one-time charge. It's a development impact fee on new non-residential development. You need to prepare a nexus study to support the adoption of that fee. Very often the nexus studies result in fees that are quite a bit higher than what you would ever want to charge. So you end up adopting fees much lower than what the nexus supports, but you still need a nexus fee. And then as new non-residential development occurs, you're taking in some revenue to, you know, put towards affordable housing in your community.
And the nexus and linkages that you're creating housing that working folks need to live in by your establishing new businesses in a community.
Exactly. You build non-residential development, that non-residential development is filled with employees, some of whom might make plenty of money to buy a new home or rent an apartment, but others who might not. And so we do an analysis looking at how much those employees earn and then what sort of housing they can afford. And we look at the gaps that result from that.
All right, and so that's all the audience questions we have. I would like to round it out with just one question of my own, which is, you know, this was a study of case examples, right? A case study in many ways, looking at those valley jurisdictions that have inclusionary housing policies already and trying to apply lessons to others that might be able to accommodate them. Did you come away with any lessons for the valley as a whole from the study?
Yeah, I think so. So it's just super important to keep monitoring conditions and looking for opportunities where there is market rate development happening. Because if market rate development is happening, you know it's feasible, right? If it's happening, then someone's decided to go forward with it. And then you're looking for signs that there's going to be enough of a price difference. And I think that there is no one blanket. You know, if anything, my aha moment was that we are not yet in a place in the San Joaquin Valley where we can say inclusionary housing is going to work everywhere. Just in our case studies, you know, 50% looks like it could work, 50% looks like, you know, we would say not now. So there's no one size fits all. There are ways to think about this at a sort of regional level where we can get you a lot of the way there towards this thinking, but you really are going to want to, you know, think about it based on your own market conditions. But you're looking for adequate market rate development at prices that more than cover your development costs, so that there's room to absorb an inclusionary requirement.
If I could add to Ashley's comment, it may well be those counties and COGs that are within a commute shed for an impacted metro area. I'm thinking, I mean, that's why, you know, the Stockton, Ripon area made sense to look at, because it's in the Bay Area's commute shed. Bakersfield and other cities in Kern County might also be worth looking at, because they're within a commute shed as well. When I looked at various cities in my practice and doing housing elements and so forth, I only considered inclusionary as even a discussion topic in those cities that had that kind of external demand, because that is where, you know, the higher economic demand originates. You know, if you're talking about, and you know, and Fresno may have enough internal within itself that it can do it. But if you're looking at a Chowchilla, I'm just pulling that out of the air, but you know, that would be darn hard to have the economic ability to support an inclusionary program.
All right. And with that, I think we can wrap it up, Michael.
Yes, thank you, everybody. We're starting to lose people. We're a little bit after 2. Thank you so much for our panelists. Excellent presentation, very informative. Stay tuned. Our next workshop is October 17th on condo construction, why it does and doesn't work out in the San Joaquin Valley. So that's another great study that EPS has done, and we'll hear from them in a couple months then. But for now, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Appreciate you being here. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.